Glass was already scattered across my driveway when I stepped outside. Not a crack, not a ding, but full-on shattered safety glass glittering in the morning sun. My neighbors were frozen where they stood, mouths open, phones halfway raised. And right in the center of it all was our HOA president, Linda Carver, gripping a crowbar like she owned the entire street. My name is Ethan Brooks. I am a high school history teacher in Maple Ridge, Ohio, and until that moment, my biggest weekend concern had been grading papers. All I had done was invite an old college friend to stay with me for a couple of days. Nothing flashy, nothing illegal. Just a guest visiting a friend. Linda was screaming about property values while swinging metal into Daniel's windshield as people started recording. Her voice was shaking with rage, not authority. No one understood why she had snapped, only that she had crossed a line she could never step back from. What Linda did not realize, and what was about to turn this entire neighborhood upside down, was who that truck actually belonged to. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? To understand how things escalated that far, you have to understand what life was supposed to be like in Maple Ridge. On paper, it was the kind of place people brag about when they move in. Quiet streets. Identical mailboxes, houses painted in the same safe, neutral colors. The HOA brochures use words like peaceful, harmonious, and family-oriented, so often you would think they were legally required to. When I bought my home, I genuinely believed all of that. As a history teacher, routine and predictability felt comforting. I wanted a place where nothing exciting ever happened. The problem was that harmony in Maple Ridge did not come from neighbors respecting each other. It came from fear. And that fear had a name. Linda Carver had been the HOA president for years by the time I moved in. At first, she seemed like the type of person who just took volunteering a little too seriously. She wore official-looking vests during her walks. She spoke in formal emails filled with bold text and underlined phrases. But it did not take long to realize Linda was not enforcing rules. She was enforcing obedience. She had cameras mounted on the front of her house, not just pointing at her own property, but angled toward the street. More than once, I saw her standing on her porch with binoculars, slowly scanning the neighborhood like a lookout. Emails from Linda arrived constantly. Not monthly, not weekly. Sometimes daily. Lawn chairs left out too long. Trash bins visible for an extra hour, kids drawing with sidewalk chalk without prior approval. None of it felt normal, but everyone quietly complied because pushing back only made things worse. I had watched neighbors get worn down over time. One woman stopped letting her kids play in the front yard. Another neighbor repainted his fence twice because Linda claimed the color was emotionally disruptive. No one ever said her name out loud with confidence. It was always lowered voices and quick glances around, as if she might hear us through the walls. That was the environment when Daniel Cruz came to visit. Daniel and I had known each other since college. While I went into teaching, he went into law, eventually becoming deeply involved in criminal justice reform. He was visiting town for a conference downtown and asked if he could stay with me for a couple of nights instead of a hotel. Daniel was never loud, never flashy, and never the type to draw attention. He arrived late in the evening, exhausted from the drive, and parked in my driveway without a second thought. Yes, the truck was large, but it was clean, well-maintained, and clearly personal. No logos, no tools rattling in the back. just a reliable vehicle for someone who traveled often. At the time, I did not even consider it might be a problem. Guests parked in driveways all the time, or at least I thought they did. The next morning, while I was making coffee, I noticed Linda standing across the street. She was not walking. She was not chatting with anyone. She was staring directly at my driveway, phone held up, taking pictures from different angles. She moved slowly, deliberately, like she was documenting a crime scene. A knot formed in my stomach immediately. Daniel noticed it too. He laughed it off and said, "She seems thorough." I forced a smile, but I already knew where this was heading. By mid-morning, there was a folded piece of paper taped to my front door, not mailed, not emailed, hand-delivered like a warning. The letterhead read, Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, and Linda's name was printed at the bottom in bold. The notice claimed my property was in violation due to a commercial-style vehicle being parked overnight. It ordered immediate removal and warned of escalating fines for noncompliance. I read it 3 times, confused. There was no such rule. I knew the bylaws. I had read them when I moved in. Personal vehicles were allowed. Guests were allowed. Nothing even remotely close to what she was accusing existed. Daniel read the notice and calmly handed it back to me. "That does not sound enforceable," he said. His tone was polite, almost bored. Mine was anything but. This was the first time Linda had crossed into my space directly, and I could feel that familiar HOA pressure settling in. The unspoken message that fighting back would only make life harder. What I did not realize yet was that this was not about the truck at all. It was about control, and Linda had already decided she was going to prove she still had it. The next morning, I woke up with that uneasy feeling you get when you know something is coming, but you do not know how bad it is going to be. The house was quiet. Daniel was already up, making coffee like nothing unusual was happening. For a moment, I almost convinced myself Linda would back off. That lasted until I heard her voice outside. She did not knock. She announced herself. I looked through the front window and saw her standing at the edge of my driveway, wearing a bright HOA vest like a uniform and a laminated badge hanging from her neck. In one hand was a clipboard. In the other was a small laser measuring device. She looked less like a neighbor and more like someone about to shut down a construction site. She stepped onto my driveway without asking and began circling Daniel's truck slowly, pointing the laser at the hood, the tires, the mirrors. She muttered numbers under her breath, scribbling notes like she was building a case. The way she moved was deliberate, theatrical. This was not about measurements. It was about being seen measuring. Daniel and I stepped outside. He greeted her politely and explained calmly that the truck was his personal vehicle, legally registered, and that he was a temporary guest. He spoke clearly and respectfully, the way someone does when they assume reason still matters. Linda did not even look at him. She turned her body slightly so she was facing me and me alone, speaking as if Daniel was not there at all. It was subtle but intentional. A reminder of who she believed held authority and who did not. "Your guest is in violation," she said flatly. "That vehicle does not meet community standards." I asked her what standard it violated. She did not answer. Instead, she clicked the laser off and pointed down the street. "Visitor parking is available near the community center. That is where it needs to be moved." I followed her finger and felt my stomach drop. The community center was nowhere near my house. It was a long walk, especially with luggage, groceries, or anything else a normal guest might need. It was not practical. That was the point. I asked her to show me the rule in writing. I kept my voice calm, but I could feel my patience thinning. She sighed dramatically, like a teacher dealing with a slow student. "I do not need to justify enforcement," she said. "My responsibility is to protect property values, not debate residents." Daniel finally spoke again, pointing out that the bylaws allowed guest parking and that there was no mention of vehicle size or appearance. Linda's jaw tightened. For the first time, she glanced at him, but only long enough to dismiss him. "This is between me and the homeowner," she said. "You are not a member of this association." That was when I understood this was not about compliance. It was about humiliation. Linda wanted me to move the truck publicly, inconveniently, and without explanation. She wanted me to demonstrate obedience in front of my neighbors. A few people had started watching from their porches. No one said anything. No one ever did when Linda was involved. That silence emboldened her. She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice just enough to feel threatening. "You have until later today to correct this," she said. "If that truck is still here, I will handle it myself." I asked her what that meant. She smiled, thin and confident. "It means you should not test me." Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing in my own driveway feeling smaller than I ever had in my own home. Daniel looked at me and said quietly, "She is not used to being challenged." He was right. And that was exactly why she was about to push this much further than she ever should have. By late morning, I decided the best thing to do was act normal. Let things cool off. Daniel and I drove to the grocery store, picked up a few things for the weekend, and talked about anything except the HOA. I remember thinking that once Linda had time to calm down, she would realize how ridiculous she had sounded and quietly back off. That was me still believing logic mattered. When we pulled back into the neighborhood, everything looked peaceful. Kids were riding bikes. A couple of neighbors were out gardening. Someone was washing their car with music playing softly from a speaker. It was the kind of calm Saturday scene that made what happened next feel unreal. Linda was across the street, pacing back and forth in her driveway with her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, I could tell she was angry. Her gestures were sharp and aggressive, her voice loud enough that fragments carried across the street. "I am done being disrespected," she snapped into the phone. I later found out she was arguing with Marcia Lowell, the HOA vice president, insisting that the board was too weak and that she was tired of homeowners challenging authority. Daniel parked the truck in my driveway, same place it had been all along. As we started unloading groceries, Linda abruptly ended her call and stared straight at us. The look on her face was not annoyance anymore. It was something hotter. Personal. She marched into her garage and slammed the door behind her. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, but no one moved. When the garage door rolled back up, Linda stepped out holding a crowbar. For a split second, everyone froze. The sight of it was so out of place that my brain struggled to process it. A crowbar did not belong in a driveway dispute. It belonged in a nightmare. Someone laughed nervously, assuming she was bluffing. I wish she had been. Linda walked straight up to the truck and dragged the crowbar along the side with slow, deliberate pressure. The sound was awful, metal scraping paint, and it echoed down the street. A long, fresh scratch appeared instantly, bright and unmistakable. I shouted for her to stop. Daniel took a step forward, hands raised, telling her calmly that she was damaging his property. Linda turned, eyes wild, and said, "That scratch was already there." She said it without hesitation, like she had rehearsed it. Before I could even respond, Tom Newen, who had been fixing his mailbox a few houses down, spoke up. His voice was steady and clear. "No, it was not. I just watched you do that." For a moment, everything hung in the air. Linda had been caught, not privately, not later. Right there, in front of witnesses. Her face twisted, and whatever restraint she had left disappeared. "You are all lying," she screamed. "This neighborhood is full of liars." Her grip on the crowbar tightened. That was the moment I realized this was no longer about HOA rules or authority or even control. Linda was not trying to win anymore. She was about to snap completely. What happened next felt unreal, like my brain was lagging a few seconds behind my eyes. Linda did not argue with Tom. She did not defend herself. She did not retreat. She screamed, a sharp, furious sound that cut through the quiet street, and then she swung the crowbar with both hands. The first blow shattered the windshield. The sound was explosive, like a gunshot made of glass. Safety glass burst outward, raining across the driveway in glittering fragments. Someone yelled. Someone else gasped. Linda did not stop. She swung again, this time at the passenger side window, then the driver's side mirror. Glass sprayed across the pavement, catching the sunlight as it fell. "Property values," she screamed over and over, as if the words justified everything. "I will not let you ruin this neighborhood." Daniel stepped back instinctively, but his face stayed calm, too calm. He looked at me, eyes steady, and said in a low voice, "Do not intervene. Let this play out." There was no panic in his tone, just certainty. I did not understand it yet, but something in his voice made me freeze where I stood. Linda moved down the side of the truck, dragging the crowbar hard across the doors, carving deep gouges into the paint. The metal screeched with each pass. She dented the hood, then smashed the rear window. The truck looked like it was being dismantled in real time. Across the street, Rachel Moore screamed for her kids. She grabbed them by the arms and pulled them behind her, shielding their faces as glass skidded across the road. Her youngest was crying, confused, and terrified. This was no longer just destruction. It was dangerous. Carlos Medina, a retired veteran who lived 2 houses down, pulled out his phone and called the police. I heard him clearly say, "My HOA president is destroying a vehicle with a crowbar." His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. Meanwhile, Evan Millers, a teenager who had been washing his car in his parents' driveway, never stopped recording. He did not say a word. He just held his phone steady, capturing everything. The swings, the screaming, the broken glass, the neighbors backing away in shock. Linda circled back and smashed the remaining mirror. Then she attacked the tailgate, denting it again and again until the metal warped inward. Each hit felt like it landed in my chest. I wanted to shout. I wanted to stop her. Every instinct told me to step in. Daniel did not move. He stood beside me, hands visible, posture relaxed. "This is exactly what she wants," he said quietly. "If you touch her, she becomes the victim." Linda was breathing hard now, sweat streaking her face. But instead of slowing down, she seemed fueled by the attention. Every phone pointed at her only made her louder. "You think you can disrespect me?" she shouted at no one in particular. "I run this community." In less than 3 minutes, the damage had multiplied beyond comprehension. Windows gone, mirrors destroyed, panels gouged, paint stripped. Thousands of dollars in damage done in broad daylight, witnessed by half the street. And still, she did not stop. She raised the crowbar again, but this time an officer's voice cut through the chaos. "Drop the weapon." 2 patrol cars rolled up, lights flashing but sirens silent. The timing felt surreal, like the world snapping back into focus. Linda turned toward them, crowbar still in her hand, chest heaving. For a split second, I thought she might actually argue. She opened her mouth, ready to explain herself, ready to claim authority. But the officers had already seen enough. Glass everywhere, a destroyed truck, a crowd of witnesses, phones still recording. "Drop it, now," one of them repeated. Linda finally let the crowbar fall. It clattered onto the pavement, the sound dull and final. The officers moved in, separating her from the crowd, asking questions. Neighbors started talking all at once. Evan kept recording. Carlos stepped forward to give his statement. Rachel hugged her kids tightly. I looked at the truck and felt sick. Then I looked at Daniel. He met my eyes and gave a small nod, as if to say, "This is exactly where this needed to go." At that moment, I still thought this was about property damage. I still thought the worst had already happened. I had no idea this was only the beginning, and that Linda had just destroyed far more than a truck. The officers did not need anyone to explain what had happened. The moment they stepped out of their patrol cars, the scene spoke for itself. Glass covered my driveway and spilled into the street. The truck looked like it had been attacked by a machine, not a person. Paint was torn down to bare metal. Windows were gone. The crowbar lay on the ground a few feet from Linda's shoes. Linda, however, walked toward the officers like she was about to file a complaint. "This is an HOA enforcement matter," she said loudly, pointing back at the truck. "That vehicle was in violation, and I was authorized to remove it." One of the officers raised his hand immediately. "Ma'am, step back from the scene." His tone was calm but firm. "Drop the crowbar." Linda hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to back her up. No one did. Phones were still raised. Neighbors stood frozen, watching. With a sharp exhale, she let the crowbar fall. The sound it made hitting the pavement was heavy and final. The officers separated everyone quickly. One stayed with Linda. The other started asking witnesses to step forward one at a time. Carlos was first, then Tom. Then Rachel, still holding her shaken kids close. Evan never stopped recording, even as an officer gently told him to lower his phone. Linda kept talking. She talked over the officers, over the witnesses, over reality itself. "You do not understand," she insisted. "HOA authority supersedes homeowner preferences." He was non-compliant. I acted within my role. The officer looked at her and said something that cut through everything. "HOA rules do not override criminal law." That was the first time Linda seemed unsure. Just for a second. Daniel stepped forward calmly when asked. He gave his statement without emotion, describing exactly what happened, when it started, and who witnessed it. He did not exaggerate. He did not editorialize. When the officer asked for identification, Daniel reached into his wallet and handed it over. The officer glanced down at the card, then paused. He looked at it again. Then he looked up at Daniel. There was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The second officer walked over, and the first quietly handed him the identification. Both of them read it carefully. Their posture changed. Their tone sharpened, not in hostility but in precision. Daniel was the district attorney for the county. Linda noticed the change instantly. "What is going on?" she demanded. "Why are you treating him differently?" Daniel spoke before the officers could answer. "I am not asking for special treatment," he said evenly. "I am here as a private citizen. I want a standard report filed and a full investigation conducted." That sentence mattered more than anything else he could have said. It stripped away any excuse Linda might later claim. There was no abuse of power. No favoritism, just facts. Linda's face drained of color as the realization hit her. The confidence she had been running on collapsed into panic. "This is a setup," she started shouting. "This is entrapment. You are all conspiring against me because I enforce the rules." One officer calmly told her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. That is when she lost it completely. She screamed about lawsuits, about corruption, about how she ran this neighborhood. She accused neighbors of lying. She accused Daniel of hiding his identity on purpose. She accused the police of targeting her. None of it mattered. The handcuffs clicked shut. The sound carried down the street louder than the crowbar had been. Linda Carver, the woman who had ruled Maple Ridge through fear and paperwork, was led toward the patrol car as neighbors watched in stunned silence. No one cheered. No one spoke. We just stood there, absorbing the sight of authority finally being replaced by accountability. As the car door closed, I looked around and realized something had changed. People were standing straighter. Phones were no longer hidden. For the first time since I moved in, the fear felt broken. Daniel stood beside me, hands relaxed at his sides. "This is not over," he said quietly. "But it has crossed the line it needed to cross." He was right. Linda thought she had been enforcing rules. What she had actually done was give the entire neighborhood a reason and the evidence to finally stand together. The video did not spread slowly. It exploded. By the time the patrol cars pulled away, Evan's recording was already circulating through neighborhood group chats. Within hours, it jumped to local social media pages. By evening, it was everywhere. A woman screaming about property values while smashing a truck with a crowbar was not something people scrolled past. It was shocking. It was undeniable. And most importantly, it was clear. By the next morning, news vans were parked at the entrance to Maple Ridge. That was when Megan Alvarez showed up. She introduced herself as a local reporter and started doing what Linda had spent years preventing anyone from doing, asking neighbors to speak openly. Megan did not just point a camera and wait for drama. She listened. She asked calm, careful questions. And once people realized Linda was no longer watching from behind her curtains, something remarkable happened. People started talking. At first, the story sounded small. Someone mentioned a fine for leaving trash bins out too long, even though they had followed the schedule. Another neighbor talked about being warned for hanging a holiday wreath that had been approved the year before. But then the story started lining up. The same threats, the same tone, the same vague references to rules no one could ever find written down. One neighbor brought out a folder filled with violation notices dating back years. Another pulled up emails on their phone, all signed by Linda, all filled with the same language about authority and compliance. People who had barely spoken to each other for years were suddenly standing together on the sidewalk, comparing notes and realizing they were not alone. That was when Detective Hannah Park stepped in. She had been assigned to the case originally as a straightforward property destruction investigation. But as she reviewed the footage, the witness statements, and the growing pile of complaints, she realized this was bigger than a single outburst. She began asking questions that had never been asked before. Where did the fines go? Why were some violations enforced aggressively while others were ignored? Why did certain residents seem to be targeted repeatedly? As neighbors came forward, patterns emerged. Linda had been issuing fines that were not authorized by the bylaws. Some payments were collected in cash or through informal methods that bypassed HOA accounting entirely. Contracts for landscaping and maintenance had been awarded to companies with personal connections to Linda, often at inflated rates. When homeowners questioned discrepancies, they were met with threats of liens, legal action, or public shaming. Fear had been the glue holding it all together. Detective Park requested HOA financial records. That request alone sent shockwaves through the board. Meetings were canceled. Emails went unanswered. The vice president, Marcia Lowell, released a short statement claiming she had no knowledge of Linda's actions and had trusted her judgment. That statement did not age well. As investigators dug deeper, they found missing funds and unexplained transfers. They found violation notices that referenced rules that did not exist. They found evidence that Linda had altered records after disputes, rewriting history to protect herself. What had initially looked like a stress-induced meltdown was now unmistakable. This was not an isolated incident. It was a system. Megan Alvarez aired multiple follow-up segments. Each one featured another neighbor. Another story. Another example of how Linda had used the HOA as a weapon instead of a service. Viewers began sending in their own HOA horror stories from other communities, but Maple Ridge became the face of something bigger. What happens when small authority goes unchecked for too long? I watched neighbors change in real time. People who used to avoid eye contact were suddenly confident, standing taller, speaking clearly. For years, Linda had convinced them that resistance was pointless. Now, they saw the truth. She had only been powerful because everyone thought they were alone. Daniel stayed mostly out of sight during this phase. He refused interviews. He did not comment publicly. When asked, he simply said the investigation needed to run its course. That restraint mattered. It kept the focus where it belonged, on the evidence, not on him. As the weeks went on, formal charges expanded beyond property destruction, fraud, intimidation, abuse of authority. The HOA board was forced to freeze accounts and suspend enforcement activities pending review. An independent audit was ordered. Maple Ridge was not just dealing with the fallout of one violent afternoon anymore. It was confronting years of quiet abuse that had finally been dragged into the open. And for the first time, Linda Carver's voice was no longer the loudest one in the room. Once the investigation reached that stage, Daniel did something that surprised a lot of people, but not me. He formally recused himself from anything connected to the case. He put it in writing, stepped back completely, and made it clear that he would not touch the prosecution in any capacity. He said it mattered that the process stayed clean, not just for the case, but for the community. If justice was going to happen, it had to happen the right way. A special prosecutor was appointed from outside the county. That single decision crushed the last defense Linda had been clinging to. She could no longer claim bias, favoritism, or political revenge. There was no inside job to hide behind. Just evidence. And there was a lot of it. The footage of the attack alone was overwhelming. Multiple angles. Clear audio. Time-stamped recordings. But it did not stop there. Financial records told an even uglier story. Unauthorized fines. Missing funds. Emails threatening homeowners with liens for questioning charges. Contracts awarded without approval. Every thread investigators pulled only led to more. Linda's defense attorney initially tried to paint her as a stressed volunteer who had simply cracked under pressure. That argument fell apart almost immediately, mostly because Linda would not stop talking. She gave interviews claiming she had no regrets. She blamed homeowners for being ungrateful. She insisted that authority required fear. Every statement she made hardened public opinion and strengthened the case against her. When the trial began, it did not drag on. The facts were too clear. Witness after witness testified, including neighbors who had once been terrified to speak. Evan's video was played in court. The sound of the crowbar hitting glass filled the room again, and this time Linda had nowhere to look. The jury convicted her on multiple counts: property destruction, intimidation, and fraud, tied directly to her role in the HOA. Restitution was ordered to cover the damage to the truck and to repay homeowners who had been illegally fined. Her position in the HOA was permanently revoked, and she was barred from serving in any leadership role involving homeowner associations. The HOA board did not survive the verdict. State regulators stepped in and dissolved it entirely. Accounts were frozen. Records were audited. Years of decisions were reviewed. What remained of the board quietly resigned, one by one, but something better replaced it. A new HOA was formed under strict oversight, with open meetings, published budgets, and real accountability. She did not run on authority or control. She ran on transparency and trust. Her first act was to apologize publicly to the neighborhood. Slowly, the fear drained away. Kids played in front yards again. Neighbors talked without whispering. Holiday decorations went up without warnings. People who had once avoided meetings started attending them. Not because they were scared, but because they finally felt heard. Daniel eventually came back to visit, this time parking a replacement truck in the same driveway without a single complaint. We stood outside watching the street, quieter than it had been in years, and he smiled. "This is what accountability looks like," he said. He was right. Maple Ridge did not just get justice. It got its neighborhood back. Looking back on everything that happened, the hardest part to accept is how long it took us to speak up. Linda did not hold power because she was loud or smart or right. She held power because we were silent. One by one, we let small things slide, told ourselves it was not worth the fight, and convinced ourselves that staying quiet was easier than standing together. That silence gave her room to grow unchecked. Linda did not fall because of a truck. She fell because the moment she crossed the line in public, everyone finally saw the same truth at the same time. The fear that kept us isolated vanished the instant we realized we were not alone. Months later, Daniel came back to visit. He pulled into the same driveway in a replacement truck, parked it in the same spot, and nothing happened. No cameras pointed our way. No violation notices, no emails. Kids rode bikes up and down the street while parents talked on their lawns without looking over their shoulders. The cameras on Linda's house were gone, and so was the tension that had hung over Maple Ridge for years. What this taught me is simple. HOA rules do not override basic human decency. They do not outrank the law, and they certainly do not give anyone the right to intimidate, threaten, or destroy. If you ever find yourself dealing with someone who abuses power, remember this. Bullies rely on silence, but they collapse in daylight. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?